The theme of this panel discussion is satire, whose freedom of speech. So we'll be looking at issues around who decides what is and isn't freedom of speech, who decides at what point does freedom of speech become hate speech. Is it based on whose mouth these words come from, or is it kind of more complex than that? We've got quite an eclectic mix on the panel for this particular debate. So we have a Muslim, a socialist, and a humanist. That's almost like, they should start with a joke.
Not all going down the pub then?
Yeah. Except you, of course. Except the Muslim, possibly. So the format will be I'll introduce the speakers, then I'll ask them to speak. They'll speak for around 10 minutes each, and hopefully at the end there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask some questions as well. So if I start with my speaker on my left, Merryl Davies, who presumably needs no introduction in this audience. She's the co-director of the Muslim Institute. After studying anthropology, Merryl spent a decade at the BBC, working on various religious programmes, including Every Man, Half the Matter, and Global Report. She then went on to work for a London-based Muslim magazine called The Inquiry. She's a prolific author and commentator. Merryl is known for her new approach to Islamic anthropology and a highly original critique of America based on Hollywood films. She's written a number of books, including the bestseller Why Do People Hate America, which was brought out after 9/11. She articulates radical discourse shaped by dialogues between civilizations and cultures, and seeks to create a holistic understanding of what it means to be human. It's very deep.
I hope.
It's very deep. I don't know. I was just sent it and asked to read it out. On my right is Tim Sanders, who was born in Leicestershire. Studied at Harrow School of Art and specialised in the ability to draw fire extinguishers, which is quite useful in this world. Which is very useful in this world, given the number of fires raging across the world. Tim drew pocket cartoons and political cartoons. He was a cartoonist for the Socialist Worker. In 1995, began a collection of cartoons that was published in the heat of the scribble. In 1999, Tim began working as a pocket cartoonist for the Independent. He's worked for the Independent on Sunday. He's also drawn cartoons for a range of publications and newspapers, including The Guardian, Observer, Telegraph, Mail on Sunday, You Magazine, Nursing Times. Interesting. Red Pepper, absolutely. Tim also is a Spanish speaker and a scholar of Hispanic art. We welcome Tim.
Wastewater disposal. I work for that magazine as well. So.
Very essential services.
That is essential. Then to my far right is Pavan Dhaliwal. She heads up the British Humanist Association's Public Affairs and Policy team, and is responsible for their campaigns covering a wide range of issues, including equality and human rights law, ethical issues, religion and schools, and social cohesion. Pavan is also Vice President of the European Humanist Federation and has worked in high-level advisory and policy roles for over 9 years. She's an equalities and human rights expert with a special interest in youth, criminal justice and education policy. So welcome Pavan as well. So I hand over to Merryl.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So there you are, colours nailed to the mast. Now all we have to decide is whose intolerance is it anyway. In the aftermath of the massacres in Paris, I was asked to participate in a radio discussion on BBC Wales. And the first question was, what would the Prophet think of the events in Paris? I don't know whether you're aware of what was the cover of the memorial issue of Charlie Hebdo, that they somewhat increased their press run for in the aftermath of events. But it showed a caricature of the Prophet weeping. So I said, I am absolutely convinced that were the Prophet with us today, he would weep at events in Paris. But I am not sure that a gross caricature of the Prophet on the front cover of Charlie Hebdo is quite the way to make the point. At which point, another participant in the conversation, excuse me, no, how can you possibly be saying this? The lady was a Christian who was busily engaged in wanting to tell me that as a Muslim I am obligated to be offended. Whose freedom of expression are we talking about? My freedom to interpret my religion and express it as I understand it, or my freedom only to be told by people who do not believe, do not think Islam is reasonable, and do not think Islamic views should be tolerated, to tell me what I believe. And that essentially is the problem we're dealing with today. So I want to clear some definitions in this. Now, satire is a long-standing artistic convention about ridiculing prevalent vices and follies. It is a way of telling truth to power. As has been mentioned many times in the enormous amount of material that has been written following the Charlie Hebdo incident, Charlie Hebdo was using satire frequently, consistently one might say, to humiliate the weak rather than to punch up to power. And that is a very important point, because in preparing for this, I was looking at Robert Hargreaves' book on freedom of speech. He's a well-known former foreign editor of ITN. And he refers to the Rushdie affair. Now, as an alumni of the Rushdie affair myself, and I have the scars which I will share with you later, he makes the point, and I quote, "In the Rushdie case, the harm was caused by an intolerant minority in the face of a tolerant but passive majority." He goes on to make the point that this tolerant but passive majority is into relativism. All things are relative, therefore you have to allow people to express their outrage. But he then goes on to make the point that intolerant minorities in a previous generation led to fascism and Nazism in Europe, and immediately then goes on to link this to 9/11. So basically anyone who protested and complained about Rushdie is a late incarnation of fascism and a precursor of 9/11. That does not create what I would call the context for a sensible, open and free discussion about differences of views. The one thing I want to say about satire is that it always occurs in a context. It's a cultural artifact. It is a product of a particular society with a particular history. Humour, as the British are so fond of pointing out, is not a universal. Do the Germans have a sense of humour? Is the perennial British quip. The implication being that, of course, they don't. The other point, and Muslims, presumably because they have such thin skins, cannot possibly have a sense of humour. This amounts in a society that knows nothing of the tradition of satire, which is a staple of virtually every Muslim society in the world. Every time I come to London, I stay with the venerable chair of the Muslim Institute, and I am invited always to watch an episode of Gio's famous satirical... Thank you, he pronounces it so much better than me. Which is a virulent satire on the powerful of Pakistan, in which religion may very well be implicated but not necessarily directly addressed, because all societies have their do's and don'ts. Every Muslim society that I know, I lived for many years in Malaysia, satire abounds. The tea shops are full of scurrilous humour about the corruption of the political system. But this humour is invisible and unknown to the majority of commentators in France and in Britain, who see only thin-skinned Muslims who cannot take a joke. The problem, as with the Rushdie affair, is the ability to understand and comprehend what is being attacked and what is being said. How can someone without sufficient knowledge of what Muslims think and how Muslims think understand the nature of offence and outrage? Now, it is perfectly true that in all societies you have a right to be offended, you have a right to be outraged. How you respond to it is what we need to talk about. Because how secure and safe is the social harmony of a society in which one section of the community feels that they are perennially being belittled and humiliated, demeaned by the opinions that are being expressed by people who do not know what they are talking about. Social harmony requires mutual, not just mutual respect, but mutual comprehension. If you consider this, in France you have a magazine that is using its right to offend as a moral duty to a whole range of targets. But you have in France a situation where right-wing nationalists are racist and left-wing upholders of laïcité, secularism, are also racist. And the one thing that they both agree about is that a communal group identified as Muslims, despite the fact that they are French-born citoyens, are not acceptable. And this group of people happens to be marginalised, discriminated against, underrepresented in all sections of society, and yet they are fair game for criticism. That's not a recipe for social harmony in any way, shape or form. The other thing that you have to look at is the economy of the media. Who gets published? Who gets to make television programs? Who gets to make radio programs? Who writes for the press? Who comments and whose opinion is published and broadcast? Unless there is comprehension, my problem has always been that those people who ran the BBC and ran religious programs had no idea where to begin with the Muslim community. It isn't structured like the Christian community. There's no pope, they can't go to clerics, they don't know who to go to. For nearly 15 years in this country, the late Zaki Badawi was the voice of Islam. After that, I mean, you need to be aware that Anjam Chowdhury has been the voice of the Muslim community for a great deal of time, and is always invited to come and give his views on situations. where is the majority voice of the Muslim community? Where is the understanding that we are a community of communities with a diversity of opinions and a diversity of attitudes, and that the vast majority want nothing to do with the Anjam Chowdhuries of this world, or the Daesh, the so-called Islamic State of this world? Where is their voice to be heard? Where are their representatives to be called on? In the Rushdie affair, myself and Zia sat down and wrote a book to deconstruct and make available to people an understanding and an insight into the affair. We hawked it round every publisher in London, none of whom wanted to print it. The editor of our editor at Mansell actually took early retirement to set up his own imprint in order to publish it. And then a book arguing with Rushdie in a book was constructively ignored by the media. That is an economy of the media which is unsustainable in a plural society. It is also a culture or an economy of the media which cannot promote harmony and mutual comprehension. Without that, you are fueling the fires of intolerance. Because at some point, people say, I will be heard. And it is the lunatics and the crazies who will make their voices heard. That, it seems to me, is the problem we have to try to transcend. The only way to do it is through a process of mutual understanding, being open to me defining what I believe and how I understand it, and being given credit for at least knowing something of what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merryl. So the key message there was around mutual respect and mutual comprehension required between communities. We'll now move straight over to Tim.
Right, well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me, and it's very distinguished company, and I'm glad we're talking about tolerance, because you're going to have to tolerate the ramblings of a cartoonist now, which are not possibly quite as eloquent as that. But anyway, I suppose the first thing to say, it's quite obvious, it's so obvious it hardly needs to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway, that these attacks were quite horrific, you know. And as a cartoonist, I felt they were very close to home, you know. As Joe Sacco, a very famous cartoonist who lives in America, said, you know, this was my tribe. So there's a very strong personal sense of this atrocity, really. But of course, it's not enough just to condemn it. We have to ask why this attack took place, however horrific it was, and there is an explanation. And I think part of that explanation is visible in the way that Charlie Hebdo changed over the years. It started out around 68 in years of revolution in France, and was a truly radical and a really brave fighting magazine, and it had great cartoons in it, and they were, you know, ferociously satirical, and also, as we often hope as cartoons, they were quite funny sometimes, which is always a plus in a cartoon. But they did drift away from their roots over the years. I've got a quote which I'll read to you a bit later on. And they became increasingly establishment, you know, and for me this means that they abandoned the truth of what satire is about. For me, satire, as a cartoonist, satire is, I very much agree with what you were saying, it's really attacking the rich and the powerful, the people who run our society, the people who decide that we're going to go to war, the people that decide we're going to invade other countries, the people that decide that something is intolerable if it's done by a weaker section of society and therefore oppress it. And, you know, as cartoonists, we have to, as effectively as we possibly can, expose their hypocrisy, their lies, their deceit, which, you know, the expression that satire is dead. Well, sometimes it does seem like that, because the audaciousness of our rulers, the hypocrisy is so blatant. You know, the march that was called in Paris, where these murderers walked through the city carrying "Je suis Charlie" posters. You know, that made me want to say "Je suis ne pas Charlie." You know, and I'm a cartoonist. You know, and these people who were murdered were my brothers and sisters in this way, not just as human beings but as artists. And of course it's outrageous, but there's a reason for it. And I think if satire isn't exposing the rich and powerful, what is it doing? If satire is kicking downwards, that's not satire, that's bullying. And I think we can see examples of that all over the place. I mean, you know, let's be fair, sometimes bullies are quite funny. You know, they make a good gag. It works. They make a lot of people laugh, but it's still bullying. I mean, a really good recent example of that would probably be Jeremy Clarkson, wouldn't it? You know, I think that sort of attitude is something which people might say, oh, he's having a laugh. He's just being his boisterous self. But he was bullying and intimidating someone with less power than him. And that's what a lot of the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo of the most recent years have done. I mean, there's the ex-editor of Charlie Hebdo who left. I'll just read this quote. Shortly after resigning over the magazine's rightward lurch, former Charlie Hebdo journalist Olivier Siran wrote, "Scarcely had I walked out, wearied by the dictatorial behaviour and corrupt promotion practices of the employer, Charlie Hebdo, than the Twin Towers fell and Caroline Furet arrived in your editorial team." She was the editor. This double catastrophe set off a process of ideological reformatting, which would drive off your former readers and attract new ones, cleaner readership, more interested in a light-hearted version of the War on Terror than the soft anarchy of cartoonist Jebe. Little by little, the wholesale denunciation of beards, beardies, veiled women and their imaginary accomplices became central axis of your journalistic and satirical production. So I think that's an example of that sort of satire. There's another quote here of the founder of Charlie Hebdo, who's in his 80s now, and he was outraged by the drift of this. His name is Henri Roussel. He says, "I don't much like it when a head of state speaks of the dead as heroes. It usually happens because citizens have been sent to war and not come back, which is rather the case with the victims of the attack on Charlie Hebdo. The attack is part of a war declared on France, but can also be seen in the light of wars France has got itself involved in, conflicts where its participation isn't called for, where worse massacres than that at Charlie Hebdo take place every day, several times a day, where our bombardments pile death upon death in the hope of saving potentates who feel threatened and are no better than those who threaten them. If Obama had not held Hollande back, he would have gone after Assad in Syria, but as Sarkozy went after Gaddafi in Libya, with the results which we are familiar with." He goes on to say, from a more personal point of view, talking about Sharp, who was the editor, who was murdered at the time as well. He said, "He was the boss. Why did he need to drag the whole team into it? In the first attack on Charlie Hebdo in November 2011, the offices were torched after an issue was called Sharia Hebdo. I quote what it said in the Nouvel Observateur. I think we are ignorant and imbeciles who have taken a pointless risk. That's all. I think that's all. We think we're invulnerable. For years, decades even, we do provocative things, and then one day the provocation comes back at us. It didn't need to be done." And I think that's a really crucial phrase there. It didn't need to be done. Why were they issuing these provocations? They weren't against the rich and powerful. They're against a marginalised, persecuted section of society. And these are rather ugly and quite badly drawn caricatures, in my opinion. But I'm going to show you some, just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that Charlie Hebdo was having. This is a front cover of Charlie Hebdo. This is the Prophet. It's meant to be, and of course, it's a really racist caricature. It reminds me of when I was a youngster, seeing some of the stuff that the NF and people like that used to put on their covers. And if you put a Star of David on there, that could be an anti-Semitic caricature quite easy. I mean, it's repellent, and it's not satire. It's just, for me, it's a vile provocation. As is this, which is it's something about Sharia law, where allegedly violence against women is part of that tradition there. Another one here. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's actually hard to imagine something like that in this country, thankfully, but it was mainstream, in inverted commas, satire in France. These women are supposed to be jihadi brides, and what they're saying, roughly, is that don't touch our child benefit because we want to spend it on. I mean, God, that is not satire. It's just rubbish. Now, I'll just end the bits where I'm rambling on about drawing, showing you these two. This, again, is an example of Charlie Hebdo satire. This is shortly after the massacres in Egypt, where Muslim Brotherhood members were gunned down by the regime in the military coup. And it says here, the Quran, I'm not going to say it literally, but the Quran is useless. It doesn't protect against bullets. It's saying, ha, 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 ha. So there we see a man being murdered, and we insult his religion at the same time. Now, interestingly enough, because this whole issue has been framed in terms of tolerance and how tolerant. 3 minutes left. This is just a precious. You're just trying to. You're just getting started. Yeah. So we're talking about the freedom of expression in a country which has banned the veil and has banned demonstrations pro-Gaza, etc. A 16-year-old boy produced this, which I think is a genuinely satirical attack on Charlie Hebdo. He spelled the name slightly differently, and he's riffing on the original Charlie Hebdo cover, which is the Quran not being any good at protecting bullets, and he did Charlie Hebdo's rubbish. It doesn't protect against bullets. It's the same joke, but actually it does have the merit of, I mean, all right, it's a bit ugly given the circumstances it happened in, but at least it's attacking authority and power. The boy was sent to prison. Okay, so that's the scope of tolerance in this allegedly tolerant society. So I think I'll just finish by saying, taking the mickey out of the beliefs of people who are a minority and are oppressed is wrong and ugly, and it's not satire. But doing that to the deeply held beliefs of people whose countries you've invaded and smashed and shattered is beyond ugly. It's quite hideous. It's certainly not. It's not satire. It's literally adding insult to injury. And I think a good starting point to prevent further things like this taking place would be not to invade those countries and then not to insult the victims of that invasion.
What a good idea. What a good idea.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. The key message there was when satire is not against the rich and powerful, it effectively becomes bullying. We now move over to Pavan.
Okay, thank you so much for having me to speak here today. I guess it's going to come as no surprise to you that as a humanist I will be defending vociferously the right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. I was really pleased that Zaidan started off giving this context of the tradition of critical thinking and free inquiry within the Islamic world, because I found that since Charlie Hebdo, I've been invited to speak at a number of similar events, usually within university campuses, then it seems to be that there seems to be a complete whitewash of history, and it has been taken over by these quite young reactionary forces, and it's important, it's imperative that particularly young people have an understanding of their own cultural and their religious traditions, ones that are based in fact and sort of not hijacked by others. Now, I think it's important to note, so I'm speaking obviously as a humanist and as a secularist, but also as part of a visible minority. And I'm very aware of the changing face of racism within our society and the incitement to hatred that a lot of these things will lead to. But in my mind, anti-Muslim bigotry, in effect, and this is how it plays out on the ground, is plain racism. I myself have been subject to that. People don't see me and think, oh, there's a humanist or an atheist. People will target you because you're a bit part of a visible minority. And I sit, part of my job, I sit on the Crown Prosecution's hate crime scrutiny panel, representing both race and religion and belief. And when it comes to the recording of hate crime against communities, you will find that people who are targeted, whether it's for anti-Muslim bigotry, is because they are part of a visible minority. Now, racism in our society, be it thuggish street attacks or be it institutionalised, is no innovation, and people use lots of justifications to justify what is their very hateful behaviour. Now, back to the matter at hand, for the purposes of this discussion, I think it's really important that and it has to be acknowledged that beliefs which to some are sacred may be completely hateful to others. And religious beliefs cannot be exempted from this process. It's imperative that the distinction between ideas and then people is insisted upon at all times. The satirist should never attack people for what they are, only what they think, and religious beliefs and ideas, like any others, are open to the same degree of scrutiny, including mockery. And I've been really fortunate to have been brought up within a rich sort of cultural tradition, and in fact my grandfather introduced me to the poetry of Mirza Ghalib from a young age, and I can't imagine somebody, many people will have been completely offended by that. Should people have been burning his poetry? Should he have been killed for writing such poetry? No, because this is very much within the tradition. So the rich cultural and religious tradition as it's actually evolved over time. Now, I've heard the claim that religious beliefs are different to non-religious ones, and they're an intrinsic part of one's identity, and to attack them is to make a personal attack. Now, I've heard that communists were often wedded to their ideas up to the point where they were willing to die for them. And many racists also have a real visceral attachment to their beliefs. Now, should we indulge them because their beliefs are so deeply held? And in any case, I would challenge anyone to show me how my humanism is in any way less intensely felt than somebody's faith, or the faith of a Muslim or a Sikh or a Zoroastrian or any other religious or belief group. And I think Kenan Malik hit the nail on the head when he said that there is something deeply pernicious, almost racist, about the claim that Muslims are somehow so different from everyone else. Now, though efforts to restrict free speech and freedom of expression may be put forth with the best of intentions, and that's to protect vulnerable or oppressed minorities, the effects in reality are very different. And those who can suffer most from a culture of censorship are actually minority communities themselves. And actually, I think it's worth noting at this point that even framing it around that, the whole notion of this sort of protection of minority lines, I think that's a sort of racism of low expectations, because we're part of a minority that we are somehow oppressed and we're somehow more vulnerable than others. And I think that, although quite well-intentioned, it tends to be white liberals put forward this view, and I think that they do us a great disservice by actually doing this. Now, it's not Muslims as a whole that hold sensibilities that would forbid mockery of their religion. It's the most regressive, reactionary representatives of Islam. It's these elements that react most ferociously to having their power challenged, and they who are ultimately respected by restrictions on free expression. We do not respect Muslims by shielding their beliefs, deeply held though they may be, from criticism. Now, a part of this criticism may include satire and parody as legitimate critical devices. And though all people deserve respect, not all ideas do. And often the most effective way to expose them and expose bad ideas is to throw them into sharp relief. It's also not a mark of respect towards Muslims to assume, as the far right do, that they are incapable of handling robust challenges or even mockery of their religious beliefs. Now, we often remember the case made for the rights of those to express their views in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, but there is a further injunction worth remembering. To restrict free speech also curtails the right of others to hear the arguments that are being made. This is not a right to be restricted to white liberals, but one fundamental to a functioning, diverse society of individuals. People are not defined entirely by the religion of the community they are born into. Religious beliefs are held at the level of the individual, and I'll say it again, individuals are the ones that have rights, the right to free speech and all of its attendant benefits. It is they who are free to interpret their religion or leave their religion as they see fit after hearing an open argument as to the merits of different beliefs. Now, I believe secularism, and we can have a discussion about the different types of secularism, because I certainly don't advocate a French style of secularism, is the best guarantor of individual liberty in a world where people hold mutually contradictory views on ethical issues. The price we pay is offence, but offence is a subjective value. Nothing worth saying is inoffensive to everyone, and nothing worth saying goes unopposed by the vested interests who stand to lose from it. Now, if we're to believe that to lampoon the Muslim religion is to attack the powerless, it's quite a curious state of affairs that cartoonists such as Martin Rosen openly admit that they self-censor images depicting the Prophet. Now, to impose a state of self-censorship under fear of death amongst writers and artists is to demonstrate power in its most chilling form. Ceding power to the most regressive elements within what we term the Muslim community by imposing restrictions on free speech is also to portray those Muslims who are fighting against reactionary religious ideas and institutions, as well as those who suffer daily injustices under the doctrines of regressive religion. Now, if you're lucky to live in a country where you have the right to vote, to oppose your government, or to criticise the established religion without fear of punishment, that's because those rights have been hard fought for. Now, we work with our fellow human rights activists across the world, be they Muslims, Christians, the non-religious, who see these as the bedrock of a progressive society, and people are daily killed. Colleagues of mine, who I hold in the highest regard, and they fight for these rights, where the vested interests will suppress them by any means necessary. Now, where different beliefs are deeply held, clashes are unavoidable, and they should be openly resolved rather than suppressed in the name of respect or tolerance. But more than this, the giving of offence is not just inevitable, but it's also vitally important. Any kind of social change or social progress means offending some deeply held sensibilities, or to put it another way, you can't just say or draw that. Is all too often the response of those in power to having their power challenged. The notion that it is wrong to offend cultural or religious sensibilities suggests that certain beliefs are so important that they should be put beyond the possibility of being insulted or caricatured or even questioned. The importance of the principle of free speech is precisely that it provides a permanent challenge to the idea that some questions are beyond contention. The right to subject each other's fundamental beliefs to criticism is the bedrock of an open, diverse society and the basis of promoting justice and liberties in such societies. Once we give up such a right, we constrain our ability to challenge those in power and therefore to challenge injustice. Now, if we do not deem it the job of the satirist to point out these injustices or ridicule the religion used to justify them, then we admit that only some people are unfortunate enough to suffer injustices at the hands of the wrong kind of oppressor.
Thank you very much, Pavan. So one of the key points there was to differentiate between ideas and people, so by all means attack ideas, including religious ones, but not the groups of people who follow them.